Okay, so this is the behaviourist approach. This follows through the section in the approaches booklet. So it covers pretty much all the information you need. So you could just follow this through even without using the booklet, but I would suggest you do have your approaches booklet with you when we're looking at pages 16 to 26. So the behaviourist approach includes classical and operant conditioning. In the approaches booklet, under this title of the learning approaches is also social learning theory, but that is covered separately. Okay, so this screencast is just looking at classical and operant conditioning, which is behaviourist approach. So pages 16 to 26 in your approaches booklet. If you don't have that, you can follow through just taking notes and or using your textbook as well. I do refer to page numbers and activities, so that's the ideal way of doing it. Okay, so as an introduction, first of all, then, so we're on page 17 of the booklet. The behaviourist approach, it all came about by rejecting introspection. So rejecting this idea that because introspection is seen as too vague, it's all a bit wishy-washy and a little bit vague. The behaviourist approach is much more about observable events. Can we see a response to this stimulus? Can we actually see that the behaviour is changing as a result of what's going on in the environment? That's what the behaviourist approach is interested in. Not looking at, what does that person, what might they think or feel? It's looking at what we can see. And the suggestion, the basic principle really of the behaviourist approach is that human behaviour can be explained in terms of conditioning. And this is a very basic form of learning. There's two types of conditioning that we'll look at. So we'll look at classical conditioning first of all, and this is based on the idea of learning through association. So you learn a behaviour because you are associating, or I guess finding a relationship between two stimuli. Operant conditioning, learning through reinforcement. So your behaviour will be met with a response or a consequence, and whether that consequence is good or bad will determine whether or not you're likely to carry out that behaviour again. So we'll start first of all then with classical conditioning. So as I said, classical conditioning is based on the concept of learning through association. So all animals, including humans, are born with reflexes. So natural reflexes are things that you are born with that happen without you having to learn anything. So for example, salivation when food is taken. So when you eat, you salivate because saliva is designed to help you digest. So that's just what happens naturally. And we can break the reflexes down to the stimulus, in this case the food, the thing that's happening in the environment, and the natural response, i.e. the salivation. So the salivation happens as a response to the presentation of the food. And classical conditioning focuses on this idea that when other stimuli are consistently associated with the stimulus, they eventually trigger the same response, and the animal or the human can be said to be classically conditioned. So if you are pairing some fairly neutral, arbitrary stimulus with the food, for example, then you can, the animal or the human can learn and become conditioned. So the best way of looking at it really is by looking at an example. And Pavlov is the man we want to be talking about. So he carried out his research in the 1890s. And actually, he was interested in digestion. So he wasn't looking at classical conditioning. He was interested in measuring saliva when dogs were presented with food as a way of understanding digestion more. But what he found was that the dogs, not only did they salivate when they were given food, but they also salivated when he entered the room or when one of his assistants entered the room, even if they didn't have food with them. So he started to think, that's interesting. Why might that be? So before you watch the video clip or read on any more, just pause the presentation a moment and just have a quick think, why is this? Why are the dogs salivating when somebody enters the room? Just see if you can work out what's happening, and that will kind of help you understand the research that he's about to carry out. So pause for a moment and then play when you've had a think. Okay, so hopefully you've had a think about that. The idea being that the dogs salivate when he enters the room because they are associating the door opening with the food being presented. So therefore they are being conditioned to respond with salivation. So there's a video clip here to watch. So I would recommend that you watch that now. And then once you've watched it, carry on with the presentation. So Pavlov's research hopefully from that video clip it's kind of made sense to you. There's a summary of it in the textbook as well, and then I've just got sort of a brief kind of diagram really of showing you what's happening. So you do need to kind of know all of the terms. So let's have a look. So before conditioning has taken place, so before any learning has taken place, any pairing has occurred or anything, food leads to salivation. We know that the dogs will salivate when they're presented with food. The food is what we call the unconditioned stimulus, i.e. it's the stimulus that leads to a response, but it's unconditioned. It just happens naturally. The salivation is the unconditioned response. That's just the response that happens when food is presented. It hasn't been learned. Before conditioning takes place, the bell is a neutral stimulus. It just doesn't, it has no response at all. The dog doesn't salivate, doesn't really do anything. It's a neutral stimulus. So then the important part then, during conditioning. So when conditioning is taking place, the food and the bell are presented together. So we know that the food is the unconditioned stimulus and the bell is the neutral stimulus, but we're pairing them. So the dog's response, of course, is still going to be salivation because the food is there. At this stage, during the conditioning, the salivation is still the unconditioned response, okay? The dog is salivating to the food. But after conditioning has taken place, so after there's been several pairings, the bell becomes not the neutral stimulus anymore, but it becomes the conditioned stimulus, or CS. The stimulus has become conditioned, and the dog's response to that bell is salivation. So salivation to the bell is the conditioned response. It's no longer unconditioned because the dog has had to learn. It's had to learn through association to respond in this way. So the bell becomes the conditioned stimulus rather than the neutral stimulus. And as you would have seen in the video, after pairing has taken place enough, the bell will ring and the dog will salivate as a response, and that's the learned behaviour that's taken place. So if you're happy with that, if that makes sense, then that's great, move on. If you're still a little bit unsure, then as I said, go and look at the textbook chapter, or again, you can just do a bit of a Google search. There's lots of different YouTube video clips with summaries of Pavlov's research, so you can have a little read up or have a watch of a video. So you do need to make sure you're quite clear on what's happened here. Okay, so that's kind of the main part of classical conditioning, the idea of learning through association, and Pavlov's research is our way of illustrating it. So first off then, can complete the activity on page 17. It's just matching the terms. So you've got the four main terms there and their different definitions. So just match those as a quick test of your learning. And then page 18 is a question. So using the knowledge you have gained so far, outline the main findings of Pavlov's research. So that's a 4-mark question. So you've got the video clip, the explanation on the previous slide, your booklet, and or possibly your textbook. I've realised, sorry, the slide there has missed off a word there, but that's just saying and or your textbook. In your 4-mark question, make sure you're using the correct terms. Unconditioned stimulus, conditioned response, all of those terms. When you write them out the first time, you must write them out in full. So you must write unconditioned stimulus and then put UCS in brackets. And from then on, you can just refer to it as the abbreviated term. For terms like that, it is worth doing because obviously if you're writing unconditioned stimulus, unconditioned response every time, that is going to use up more of your time than if you just write it out once in full and then use the abbreviations. So I'll go back. I would recommend that you pause here and actually answer that question now. If you're doing it as a timed thing, give yourself about 6 minutes. But if you'd rather just sort of spend your time doing it, then that's fine. If you can try and answer the question now without kind of referring back, if you're doing it straight away, then that's great. If you need to kind of flip back and refer to your notes, obviously that's fine too. So I would suggest ideally you pause here, answer that question, and then come back to the presentation when you've finished. If you would prefer, obviously carry on with this, but make sure you do come back to that question afterwards. Okay, so other important features of classical conditioning. So we're on page 19 now, and there's just a box for each of these terms. You don't need loads and loads of detail for each of these, but you do need to just be aware of these terms. So they're in the textbook. As it says in your booklet, you can use the notes from your textbook, but I've just summarised them briefly here so I can explain them to you. So timing is really, really important. If the neutral stimulus can't predict the unconditioned stimulus, then conditioning doesn't occur. Basically, what we're saying is if you ring the bell after food has been presented, or if there's too long a gap, if you ring the bell and then, 5 minutes later you present the dog with food, then conditioning won't happen. So the two things need to be paired together, or with the bell just before the food. Okay, so timing is key. Extinction. This is a feature of classical conditioning. So really what we're saying here is that the conditioned response isn't permanent. So it's not that once the dog has learned to associate the bell and the food, you ring the bell and he salivates. It's not like he will now do that forever. If 5 years later you ring a bell, he's not going to salivate. But yes, the idea being that if you keep presenting the conditioned stimulus, eventually the conditioned response will stop if you don't also pair it with the unconditioned stimulus. Okay, so you need to keep the pairings up to allow the conditioned response to continue. But we also have this feature of spontaneous recovery. So after extinction, so if the conditioned response has stopped because it hasn't been paired enough with the unconditioned stimulus, if you then do pair together the conditioned stimulus and the unconditioned stimulus, so for example, if you start to present the bell and the food again, the link between them is formed much more quickly. So it won't take very long for that conditioned response to develop again. Okay, so extinction happens when the conditioned stimulus stops leading to the conditioned response if you don't pair it often enough with the unconditioned stimulus. But if you then do pair them together again, the link is formed much more quickly. And lastly, stimulus generalization. Once an animal is conditioned, they'll also respond to other stimuli that's similar to the conditioned stimulus. So the dog salivates when it hears a bell. This can be generalized to other sounds. So rather than like a handheld bell that you ring, it might be to a doorbell or to like metal jangling together, something like that. Okay, so we've talked about animals so far. Excuse me, we've talked about animals so far, but we're really interested in humans. So can humans be conditioned in the same way as animals? So again, I'd like you just to have a pause and really have a think about this yourself. If you think, yes, humans can be conditioned in the same way as animals, just have a think about how, and can you think of any examples of that? If you think, no, I don't really think it can really apply to humans in the same way, have a think why that might be the case. Can you think of any examples of when you think conditioning wouldn't or hasn't worked with humans? So have a pause, think about these questions and think of any examples. When you've done that, come back to the presentation and we'll move on to see what the research shows us. Okay, so we're on page 19 to 20 of your booklet, and there's research here by Watson and Rayner, and they've carried out research on this little boy known as Little Albert, with a terrifying picture on the slide. What I would suggest firstly, really, then, is that you watch the video summarising Watson and Rayner's research and then read the summary in the box on page 19. I won't go through loads and loads of detail with it because I think when you've watched the video and read the summary, hopefully it's relatively straightforward. But basically, they've got a 9-month-old little boy presenting with all sorts of different stimuli, including a white rat, rabbit, monkey, and he's not scared of any of it. But then they start presenting the white rat, and at the same time they bang a hammer against a metal bar. So the loud noise startles the baby, he cries, and they do that over and over again. They pair the white rat with the loud noise, and Albert becomes conditioned, so he becomes scared of the rat because the fear response to the loud noise and the rat become associated, so he then is scared of the rat. So that's the kind of gist of it, but have a read through all of the important bits of the study there. And then on page 20, there are a few questions. So once you've watched the video clip and read the summary, answer those questions on page 20. Again, once you've read the summary and watched the video clip, I would then attempt to answer the questions without referring back, but if you need to, then please do. So perhaps give it a first attempt without going back to your notes, but then perhaps go back over and add detail if you need to do that. Okay, so looking at those exam questions, look at the number of marks that are available, making sure you're using all the correct terms. So again, I would recommend that you pause, do this work now, and then come back to the presentation when you've done it. Okay, so hopefully you've done the Watson and Rayner work. So now we're looking at the last part of classical conditioning. We're looking at evaluating classical conditioning. So this is on page 21 of your booklet. So I've only put very, very brief bullet points on the presentation because there's more detail in your booklet or indeed in your textbook. So I just want to talk through these points with you. So we've got 2 strengths and 2 weaknesses of classical conditioning. So firstly, a really, really important strength. And in fact, this is going to be an important strength of all of the approaches. Okay, so the approaches will all lead to a form of treatment. So that's always going to be an important strength because really that's the whole point of psychology. We're trying to understand people and their behavior. And one of the key benefits of that is that we can then use that knowledge and understanding to help people if they are suffering from an array of different problems. In this case, we're looking at treatments for phobias. So you don't need to go into loads of detail at this stage of how the treatment works because you will learn it separately later on when we move on to the psychopathology module. So by the end of your 2-year course, you will know the treatment and how it works in quite a lot of detail. For now, it's suffice to say that classical conditioning is used. The treatment is called systematic desensitization. And broadly speaking, the idea is that the thing that the person is scared of, for example, a spider, leads to fear. But systematic desensitization allows the client to replace that conditioned response of fear with a conditioned response of calm so that they're able to remove that phobia. So this is a very important strength because it allows us to help people. It's got real life application, which is really important. Second strength, strong explanations of how some behaviours are formed. Now, classical conditioning, the classic example of classical conditioning is attachment. Again, this is one that you'll learn in quite a lot of detail. We learn 2 theories of attachment in the attachment module, and one of them is learning theory. It's this idea that the baby attaches to its mother or father, normally mother, because of the association with food. So obviously if the mother is breastfeeding, then it's going to be the mother. If it's bottle feeding, whichever parent is doing that. But basically the baby learns to associate the parent with the presentation of food, so therefore they form this attachment because they associate that feeling of satisfaction and pleasure. So it's a very, very powerful explanation of quite key behaviours. Negatives of classical conditioning. Some species are only prepared to learn associations significant for survival. So what we're saying with this is that, for example, referring back to that attachment we just talked about, some people would argue that, okay, fine, so humans associate food with their mother because this enables them to survive. They're more likely to survive if they're attached to their mother, i.e. the person that gives them food. And so the criticism here is that some people suggest that humans especially are less prepared to learn other associations that aren't appropriate or relevant for their survival. So conditioning is more relevant when it's related to survival rather than the whole other array of behaviours we may learn. The second weakness is that it's very much a limited perspective. So on the one hand, classical conditioning has very low ecological validity, very difficult to actually apply to everyday life because the association or the relationship between the conditioned and the unconditioned stimuli is very arbitrary. It's all carried out in a lab. They've just sort of, right, we've got food and we're pairing it with a bell. It doesn't tell us a huge amount about what actually would happen in real life with real life experiences. Furthermore, the fact that animal studies are the basis for classical conditioning. So obviously we've talked about Pavlov's dogs, but there's lots of different animal research that's been carried out. So this limits how useful this is in explaining human behaviour. Okay, so that's the evaluation of classical conditioning. So we move on now to look at operant conditioning. So this is on page 22. So as we said right at the beginning, operant conditioning is based on the principle of learning through reinforcement. Now, there's 2 researchers here that you need to really know about. So first of all, we've got Thorndike, and he found that cats escaped from a cage much more quickly if they were given a food reward for doing so. So this led to his law of effect. So positive effects, i.e. rewards, lead to the stamping in of behaviour. So if you get a reward for doing a behaviour, you're more likely to do it again. Negative effects, i.e. punishments, lead to the stamping out of behaviour. So if you do a behaviour and you're punished for it, you're less likely to do it. We also need to be aware of Skinner's research, and he found that animals produce behaviour, all sorts of different behaviours spontaneously. So example being, if you've got a rat in a cage, it will do all sorts. It will climb around, it will sniff, it will explore, it might climb up on the sides, all those things it does just naturally in its way of exploring. But those behaviours are going to lead to consequences, and if the consequences are positive, the behaviour is more likely to be repeated. If the consequences are negative, the behaviour is less likely to be repeated. So that's Skinner's kind of basic principle. Behaviour is carried out spontaneously. If it's met with a positive consequence, it's likely to be repeated. If it's negative, it's less likely to be repeated. So the Skinner box. On the page in your booklet, the task says describe the Skinner box, and there's a box there for you to do that. So you could draw a small diagram, but make sure you describe in words what the Skinner box is and what it shows us. But basically it's a cage that he's designed for rats, and as I said, they'll automatically explore. So they'll stomp around the cage looking at what's going on, and by coincidence at some point they'll stumble upon a lever. When they press it, it delivers a food pellet. This is obviously a reward. The rat will very, very quickly learn to press the lever and get the food. If the food pellets stop being produced, the rat will quickly learn to stop pressing the lever. So it's just kind of going about its business exploring. By chance it steps on the lever, it gets food. Presses the lever again, gets food. It learns very, very quickly that if it presses this lever, it gets a reward. If after a while the food pellets stop being presented, the rat might try a couple more times, but it very quickly thinks, okay, I shan't bother with that lever anymore. There's a video there. Again, I would recommend you watch that, and then, as I said, complete the box in your booklet describing the Skinner box. So again, I would suggest that you pause, watch the video clip, fill in the box describing the Skinner box, and then come back to the presentation when you've done that. Okay, so next we need to move on to look at types of reinforcements. This is at the bottom of page 22. Now, important thing to say first of all is reinforcement, whether it's positive or negative, the term reinforcement refers to something in the environment that makes a behaviour more likely to happen again. Okay, so positive and negative reinforcement work differently, and we'll talk about those in a minute, but both of them lead to the behaviour being more likely to recur. So positive reinforcement is the one that you probably would think about, which is the most kind of straightforward and obvious one. When a behaviour produces a consequence that is satisfying or pleasant, i.e. food to a hungry animal or praise to a child, this will increase the likelihood of the behaviour being repeated. So like we said, the rat's stomping about its cage, happens to press a lever, it gets given food. That's positive reinforcement. It will press the lever again and get food. It will press the lever again and get food. Or if a child does something like, so they use their knife and fork properly, and their parents say, oh, well done, that's great, well done, then they're more likely to do it again. Negative reinforcement, remember, this is still leading to the behaviour being repeated, but this is when a behaviour leads to the removal of something unpleasant. So looking at the example of a person first of all, so person turning off a noisy alarm clock. The alarm clock being loud is horrible. If you turn it off, that horrible sound is stopped. So therefore, next time your alarm clock goes off, you're going to learn to turn it off quickly to stop that horrible sound, to remove the unpleasantness. So it's still encouraging you to carry out that behaviour. But instead of giving you something positive as a response, the result is the removal of something unpleasant. Example with the rats being, if the rat's in a cage and there's an electric current going underneath the bars that they're stood on, so they're getting an electric shock. Obviously, it's not very nice. It's painful. They're getting an electric shock. They stomp around the cage and they happen to press a lever, and that stops the electric shock. A little while later, the electric current starts again. The rat's going to very quickly learn to press that lever, because pressing the lever stops the electric shocks from happening. Okay, so that's reinforcement. Anything that leads to the behaviour being repeated. Schedules of reinforcement. I've just left this slide blank because it's all there for you on page 23. So I didn't want to just literally double up everything that's there. Schedules of reinforcement. So there are 5 different ones. I suggest you don't need to know every single one in full detail. But have a read through them all, make sense of them all. Continuous reinforcement, the first one, is the most kind of straightforward one. The animal or the human is positively reinforced every time a behaviour occurs. So every time you press a lever, you get a food pellet. And then there's different ones. So looking at fixed ratio reinforcement, so that you get rewarded every certain number of times, so every 5th response or something like that. Fixed interval reinforcement is where you're reinforced after a fixed time period. So you'd be reinforced every 2 minutes or 15 minutes or whatever it might be. Variable ratio reinforcement is where it's unpredictable how many times you're going to be reinforced. And then variable interval, again, it's you're reinforced depending on the amount of time that passes. It's not predictable how often you're going to be reinforced. That's the kind of the gist of it. And as you can see in your booklet, it breaks down, it tells you whether the response rate is fast or slow or medium, and whether the extinction rate is fast or slow or medium. So have a read through those, and I'll just highlight the key points there. Page 24. A real life application. This is quite a useful one, I think, just to look at, to kind of see it in a true illustration, really. So slot machines and other forms of gambling, really. If someone doesn't know the next time they're going to win money, they're going to continue putting money into the slot machine, as they'll think maybe the next coin could be the winning one. So this is an example of how if you use slot machines, it's not continuous reinforcement. You're not getting rewarded every time, but you don't know when, or if, for that matter, you're going to be rewarded. So this is variable ratio reinforcement. After an unpredictable number of times, the behaviour is reinforced. So you might have to put in money, 18 times to get a reward. You might put it in once and you get a reward. And it's that not knowing that really leads to the gambling and the kind of persistent addictive nature. You don't know when the reward is going to come. Okay, next thing to look at then, again, we're still on page 24, we're looking at punishment. So where we said that reinforcement is anything that increases the likelihood of a behaviour being repeated, punishment is where behaviour is less likely to occur because it leads to an unpleasant consequence. So if you carry out a behaviour and you are punished, you're less likely to carry out that behaviour again, in theory. Again, like with reinforcement, there's positive and negative, and it's just making sure you understand the terms. So positive punishment, adding something unpleasant as a consequence. So for example, the rat's in its cage, everything's fine, it presses a lever and it gets an electric shock. That's a punishment because it's getting an unpleasant consequence. Very quickly, the rat will learn not to press that lever. Okay, so that's the positive punishment. Something negative happens as a result of a behaviour, so you don't carry out that behaviour again. Negative punishment still means you're less likely to carry out that behaviour again, but rather than something bad being happening as a response, negative punishment is when something pleasant is removed as a response. So in this case, you can look at a teenager. So teenager is told they have to be home by whatever time. They stay out too late, therefore they're grounded. So their freedom, their ability to go out late and stay with their friends has been removed. So therefore, they're, in theory, less likely to stay out too late in the future. Okay, so those are the terms relating to punishment. Answer the questions on page 24. Again, try and do it without your notes in the first instance, but then go back and use your notes if you need to. Again, I would pause here and come back to the rest of it when you're done. We haven't got much left now, but I will answer these questions first before you move on. Okay, so last part of operant conditioning is looking at the evaluation. So same as with classical conditioning, I've just got brief bullet points here on the presentation, and there's more detail in your booklet. So first strength, use of the experimental method. So now this is a very important strength because the research is carried out in lab conditions. So for example, things like the Skinner box, we are able to control all conditions. We can directly observe behaviour, And therefore, we're able to identify a causal relationship. We can identify that this leads to this, that the cause is this and the effect is this. And this is a very important strength of the behaviourist approach, that we can directly see what's happening in a controlled environment. Second strength, where we talked about classical conditioning leads to an effective treatment of phobias, operant conditioning has led to treatments such as token economy. Now, again, you'll learn about token economy in more detail when you learn the schizophrenia module, but basically it's all about enabling patients who are hospitalised, encouraging them to behave in appropriate ways. So, for example, if an inpatient makes their bed in the morning, they get given a token. That token can be exchanged for a reward, such as a chocolate bar, or you can save up in exchange for rights to watch a film, or possibly even for time outside of the hospital, or an array of different things. Excuse me. But the idea is that the patients are rewarded for appropriate behaviour, so therefore they're more likely to carry out that behaviour again. So again, important strength here. The theory of operant conditioning has allowed the development of a treatment that benefits people. Weaknesses of operant conditioning. Research is based on animal studies. So as you know, we've talked about Thorndike and his cats. We've talked about Skinner and his rats. Skinner also works with pigeons, all array of different animals. So the problem here is, humans have free will. Humans have much more complex conscious thought and are generally much more complex beings with much more complex behaviours and things that influence our behaviours. So it's a little bit too simplistic to say, oh, well, a rat learns to press a lever if it gets a food reward, therefore this can explain all manner of different human behaviours. And lastly, operant conditioning has been criticised for ignoring other levels of explanation, such as cognitive and emotional factors. Really what we're saying is it's too simplistic to just talk about conditioning in terms of explaining behaviour. We ignore evidence that suggests that there are cognitive and emotional factors that are very, very important, but there are internal states that we can't directly see, and that's quite a criticism really of operant conditioning. On page 26, there's a question for you to answer. So again, if you can answer that now, use without your notes preferably at first, and then go back and use them if you need to, and you can use the textbook to help you. Now that's the end in terms of the booklet, but I have got one more thing I'd like to add here. So I would suggest just on paper, I want to just talk you through a very, very basic essay plan, really just to get you to kind of think about how all of this information goes together. So you have to think about the question, outline the behaviourist approach in psychology for 16 marks. Now, I would suggest the most likely sorts of questions you would get about approaches is more likely to be either an application question, where you're given a scenario or a description of a person or what's going on, and you're asked to use an approach to explain what's happening. Or you might be asked to compare different approaches, or whatever, all sorts of different ways you could be asked questions. But I think it's useful at the end of each approach just to look at the most basic level 60-mark question you could be given, and look at how you would break down and answer that question, looking at all of the information that you've got. Now, this isn't prescriptive. It's not to say this is exactly how you must answer this question, but I just think it's useful to see everything in one sort of structure, really. So your AO1, your description, your outline marks, you get 6 marks. And this is roughly how you want to break it down, I would suggest. So first we'll talk about the behaviourist approach in general, that it's all about observable behaviour and the idea of conditioning. And then you want to talk about classical conditioning, learning through association, and then talk about Pavlov's research. There are those other features as well, to do with timing and extinction and so on, but I think in reality you wouldn't really have time to talk about those as well, because you've only got 6 marks worth here across all aspects. So really learning through association, Pavlov's research, trying to get those terms in and explain what classical conditioning means. Then move on to operant conditioning, learning through consequences, and talk about Thorndike and Skinner's research. Again, you've got all the different types of reinforcement which are important, so you'd have to judge how much you're able to fit in there, really. Making sure that you don't end up writing too much at the expense of losing marks elsewhere. 6 marks worth of AO1. Even if you wrote 10 pages, you're still only going to get 6 marks for those AO1, so you do have to be strict and look at how much can you write in the time allowed. For the AO3, 10 marks, you're looking at writing 3 or maybe 4 paragraphs. Again, this is very, very important. It's about how well you explain your evaluation points, not how many evaluation points you fit in. So I would suggest, again, as time goes on through the course, you'll start to really get the hang of how much you can write in the time. You will definitely get more marks if you write 3 paragraphs, well explained and elaborated, and saying why is this evaluation important, than you would if you wrote 4 evaluation paragraphs, but they're a bit brief and they're not fully explained, okay? So I've got 4 points here, and obviously when we've gone through this whole presentation, we've had 2 strengths and 2 weaknesses for classical conditioning, 2 strengths and 2 weaknesses for operant conditioning, and I sort of merged them together really in the way that I think I would do if I was answering the question. First strength is the idea that there are treatments. So classical and operant conditioning both lead to treatment, and you can kind of merge those points together. Second strength, experimental method. That's what we talked about with operant conditioning, but of course it applies to classical conditioning as well. Both of them are based on lab studies with observable behaviour, controlled conditions where we can identify a causal relationship, and that's a very important strength of the behaviourist approach. Weaknesses, I would focus on the use of animal studies. So as we said, we've got Pavlov's dogs, Skinner's rats, pigeons, Thorndike's cats. Use of animal studies, is it too simplistic to generalise this to humans? Animals aren't as complex beings, all that sort of thing. And then finally, looking at the limited perspective, the fact that it lacks ecological validity, the fact that it is based on lab studies where we've got very kind of arbitrary pairings are made, and it's quite limited, therefore, in explaining more sort of real life behaviours and considering the complexities that go on in real complex behaviours. So that's what I would recommend for the essay plan. I would suggest you write it out in whatever form you'd like to, whether you want to have it like this, whether you want a little bit more detail looking at how you would kind of elaborate on these points. The important thing really to say is that for AO1, write enough to justify the marks, but not too much that you're wasting time that will lose you marks elsewhere. And it is a difficult technique, but you'll learn it as you go through the year. Okay, you will get much more practiced at it. For AO3, it's about making sure you do the point, explain, elaborate, or top and tail, whichever kind of technique suits you best. Broadly speaking, it's the same thing. It's making sure you say, what is the evaluation point that you're making, but why is it important? Why does it matter? I tend to focus more on the topping and tailing. So you've got your main point. So you might say, okay, so problem is use of animal studies. They use rats and blah, 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 blah. So you explain that. But your top, you need to introduce that point by saying, one weakness of the behavioural approach is that it is based primarily on animal studies. So that's your top. And as soon as you say something like weakness or strength or support or challenge or issue, that tells the examiner that it's AO3, that it's an evaluation point. Then you make your point about animal studies. And then you tail it by saying, why is that important? Why are you telling me about this? This is a weakness of the behaviourist approach because it means that we need to be careful in generalising the results to humans. We know that humans are more complex and have more emotional and cognitive functions and free will. So therefore, we need to show caution when we're extrapolating results from animals to human behaviour. That sort of thing. So topping and tailing is really important. Introduce by saying, is a strength or a weakness or an issue? Say your point, and then say why it's a strength or a weakness or an issue. Tell the examiner why you're talking about this, because that's the part that shows that you truly understand what you're writing about, that you haven't just learned a paragraph. Okay, so that sums up, I think that finishes up the behaviourist approach. If you'd paused all the way through and done the questions and all the bits and pieces as you've done it, then great. I would suggest that when you finish this, that you just go back through everything and reread it and make sure you're happy you understand it. If you've just gone through the whole screencast without pausing, then I would suggest now you go back through and answer the questions and fill bits and pieces in so that you have got it all completed, because then you've got everything there for you. Okay, thank you.